So Khalid is a writer, a photographer and an arts producer who lives in Melbourne and has worked as a creative producer at the Footscray Community Arts Centre and co-directed the National Young Writers Festival. I got it very wrong, Khalid, because I pegged you early on as a poet. Am I wrong?
No, I've written some poems, but I'm most certainly not a poet.
It's because you start your story, the story in After Australia, your narrator has just published a book of poems. So I clearly got sucked in and thought, aha, we can start talking about poetry and about that book of poems that Khalid has published. And I got that entirely wrong. So
I tell myself that I'm not a poet, but that's only because I don't really. I'm more of a fan of poetry than someone who writes their own poetry. So I'm always happy to talk about poetry.
I also pegged you wrongly because I started in on the essay, which was where I met you through growing up African in Australia. And we had that on the Writers Festival program a few years back. So I thought, oh, great, yeah, he's an essayist and a poet. And in fact, I read in the Pin, which is a good interview that someone did with you. I read that in fact the writing in Growing Up African in Australia, which came out a couple of years ago now, is not what you consider indicative or your writing normally. You said that was actually quite unusual.
Yeah, well, the thing is that I write essays, but most of the time I write essays for money. So that's usually what people find online when they search my name. But my main arts practice is, I've always thought of myself as a short story writer and a fiction writer in general. I haven't written a novel yet. I'm working on one, but so far most of my arts practice seems to be more around fiction. And I do have some concerns that I always end up working into an essay, but yeah, it's really interesting because at the same time, when people ask me that exact question, I'm like, well, I can be whatever you want me to be. I'm a writer, so I guess I can. I don't know if I'm going to write a poem in this time next year. So it really I feel like there's a bit of blurring of boundaries going on simply because I am an early career writer. So at this point, I am sort of trying a little bit of everything.
Yeah. So what you're telling me is what you are asked to write, you will write, and it doesn't surprise me that in fact you're thinking of yourself as a short story writer, because in fact the story in After Australia is really accomplished. It struck me as I mean, I kept thinking, oh yeah, he's doing that. Oh yeah, he's doing that. All right, he's doing that. And then of course the ending, which we're not going to give away, by the way, because it's a short story. So why would you want to give away what happens in this short story? But I do want to talk around what you've done in this very good short story. I guess, again, I had you pegged wrongly, and I thought, maybe after this he'll become a short story writer because it is very good. Tell me first, please, how you got involved with the After Australia anthology.
So I was in Sydney a while ago for a writers' festival, actually, and I met some writers who are associated with Sweatshop Western Sydney Literacy Program. And there was this project that was being run by Diversity Arts Australia at the time, which was a prompt was to imagine a future Australia in 2050. And then I was very flattered to be invited to contribute a piece to that anthology. Originally, it was supposed to be a small project by Diversity Arts Australia. It sort of morphed into an actual book published by a firm press. I'm not really aware of any of that because one of the things I do like about being a writer is that I don't have to pay attention to anything but the writing a lot of the time. So I submitted my piece and I hadn't really heard back for a couple of months, and then the book came out and now it's out there in the world and people are reading it and hopefully enjoying it.
So did you write this essay for After Australia? Sorry, did it again, short story.
Yeah, I was what I'm working on a novel where I had a specific notion for, I had a stylistic angle that I was working on with the novel. And part of that was, part of that is just to see if I can write a story that is more restrained than my usual style, and a story where the Titanic shifts in theme and stuff is happening in the background. In the foreground, I wanted to really foreground a really simple story about two friends and their dog, and a dog. Obviously, of course, a lot of other things. It is quite a long, short story. And yeah, so like that was the original idea, and it's written in the same sort of style as the novel that I'm working on. So originally, the writing of the short story was more of a little experiment. And when I was asked to contribute a piece to this anthology, my first thought was to finish this short story I've been working on for a while.
No, that actually makes total sense, because there's something very the voice is and when you say that the novel is stylistically like this, I suspect it's the voice of the narrator, which is very similar. Khalid, you said it once, I think, to the Pins interview, you said your writing is usually, unlike the essay in Growing Up African, is very somber. And
Yeah.
I thought, really? Because the story is really funny.
I'm glad you said that. I'm glad to hear that. I wouldn't say that this story is somber. I think at the time of that interview, I was writing more somber stories. Actually, the reason why this story is funny is because about a year ago, I got tired of reading stories where people were just being mean to each other, and the plot was driven by people not being nice to each other. And I know it sounds like a sort of a silly thing to get caught up on, but I sort of thought to myself, what if I write a story where nobody's mean to each other, where everyone just really, like, that involves a group of friends who love each other, and the problems in their life don't come from interpersonal conflict, but come from the conflict that comes from most people's lives, which is things like work and, like whether or not you're going to be paying your rent, whether or not you're, I struggle to think of examples of like larger concerns right now, because the largest concern in our lives is so overwhelming right now that we can't really think beyond it. But I definitely include things like the condition of the environment and situations that we're involved in politically, or as people who belong to identities that are being marginalized. A lot of the time, people's concerns or problems in their life don't come from other people. It comes from a larger structure that they sit within. And I wanted to write a story where the conflict did come from systems and structures as opposed to interpersonal conflict.
We should mention that After Australia is a sort of a futuristic anthology, sort of. Yours, the future almost catches up with us. It could be very soon in the future, and we won't give away the central idea.
Hopefully the central idea won't happen, because it is not a bit absurd.
Yeah, it is. But yeah, I know it didn't strike me as being. Yeah, anyway, it's been impossible, but I hope it is impossible, of course. But let's just talk about the way this story works, because the first thing that you meet in the story is Meteor, the dog, and the dog is becoming a big deal at the moment, because lots of people are talking about their dogs in the lockdown, and lots of pictures of dogs and stuff. So Meteor, it seems to me to be pretty much you cannot possibly have written about that dog without knowing one like that.
Yeah, and also a friend of mine really wants to get a dog, and I really want that for her, but I can't see it getting into her life in a way that will bring her peace or joy. Which I know it's not true, because I've never owned a dog, so I don't know the unique pleasures of ownership can bring to you. But she's been talking about getting a dog for so long, and I've always been like, well, what I know of your life, I can't really see a dog fitting in there. And this story is the way to sort of imagine what that would be like. And of course, the dog is also based on like a dog that my friend owns, whose name is Magic, not Meteor.
It's near enough. He's a great dog. It's a beagle, by the way, for those people who are wondering what sort of dog Meteor might be, and a very naughty dog. It's a great dog. And that gets you into the whole, what you said then about people being nice to each other, and they're nice to each other in the way that I imagine a lot of young people in work situations. The narrator works in a pub, and maybe at this point I'll mention that you do this thing, which I think you've mentioned elsewhere as well. You're really interested in the way where we live and how we live, that the landscapes of where we live influence the sort of people we are. And you do this thing where you play with real stuff, like there's the what do you call it? The Dan O'Connor Hotel? Yeah. Which of course I believe now the Dan O'Connell, the famous hotel, has just gone up for sale. It's a huge change.
Oh, it's my favorite pub, actually. That's my local. My best friends live around the corner from the Dan O'Connell, and of course, when I was writing the story, obviously I based it on my favorite pub. But I'm glad you picked that up, because that's a really, I guess people who live in Melbourne will pick that one up.
But you change them everything a little bit. Like La Mama becomes La Mama with a double M, and you live in, I think he lives in Carpenter Street. I actually looked it up. I looked up, is there a Carpenter Street in Carlton? And there's not. There's one in Brighton, of all places, and Brighton's been in the news a little bit. So why are you doing this? Why are you shifting the reality just a tiny bit?
Part of it is I tend to do that in my work a lot, where it tends to have the verisimilitude is there, but only enough for the story to be credible. So, like, in terms of the story being attached to real life situations and real life places, I prefer to have it just enough for it to feel right. Whereas in like the actual hotel Dan O'Connor, it's actually not even spelt the correct way. It's spelled with a Conner, and there's only one O'Connor that I know of when I was doing the research for this story who spelled their name like that, and they're an actor who lives in America. So like it is a little bit deliberate, but it is a little bit fun. It's partly because I wanted to write a story set in Yarraville, but I didn't really want to attach it to a specific place. So none of the places' names match up one-to-one, and even the park in the story the park is actually Yarraville Gardens, and it's across the road from my house. And but in the story, it's called Yarraville Park. So I don't know why. I suspect there's I could come up with a really, thoughtful reason why that's the case, but a lot of it's because I find it funny and I like doing stuff like that.
It is a thoughtful story though, so don't and the narrator is self-deprecating too. So yeah, I think there's all those reasons happening as well. I actually had to look up Dion Brand, who's a poet, because you'd done this thing. I actually thought, hang on, is this just a name he's throwing in? And then thank you for this, because I looked up Dion Brand and I found her recent collection of poems, which you're obviously a fan of. So there's this, it's larded too with lots of reference to real writing. So why have you done that?
Well, Dion Brand is a poet who I've largely been reading exclusively for over a year now, where I've just been reading and rereading her book Inventory, which came out, I think, 2 years ago. And it really made sense to me that this book that has changed my life it really made sense to me that it also would have changed the life of this poet, who's also a huge fan of the work. And part of it is I had some larger thematic concerns about writing so there's a scene in the story where the narrator forces himself to appreciate the beauty of the light that filters through the trees as he's walking towards a cafe. And he talks about how the reason why the light is so beautiful this morning is because there's a lot of smog in the air and there's a lot of particles in the air that scatter the light. And he sees this beautiful light filtering through the tree, and his first thought is, isn't that a shame because of the smog in the air or because of the particles that are, forest cover being burnt in all over Australia? And this was obviously written during the bushfire crisis of 6 months ago. And there's a scene where, in that scene, he reminds himself specifically to remember that appreciating something to be beautiful can be just a thing in of itself. So like that it is important to recognize goodness and beauty and light and things that are good in the world. And that doesn't have to be oppositional to everything that's bad in the world, that the good can coexist with the bad. In fact, it can even coincide with the bad. In the case of and that was the case. I don't know if you were in Melbourne or Sydney during the bushfires, but one of the things that really surprised me was just how beautiful the light was during the evenings. And I remember constantly seeing that and seeing it as a bad thing. And it took me a while to be like, no, the light is beautiful and purple, and the sun's setting, and the light's being scattered in the atmosphere, and it looks breathtaking. But it's also something that I look at and realize is a bad thing because of the continent's forest cover being turned into particles that hang suspended in the air. That is what is scattering the light. And I think a lot of the story is about that. A lot of the story is about holding those two things up at the same time. And Dion Brand's work engages so deeply with that notion and that idea that including it seems to me to be not just obvious, but also necessary to the story.
That's a terrific answer. Because that got me onto the voice as well. This contemplative young man. I'm assuming he's young. Yes, of course he is, because the way he talks and what he's doing. He's working in a pub, and the way I hear the voice is it's a little bit like that painting of Icarus falling from the sky. You know, there's the daily stuff going on. You know, he's taking the dog to the vet. He's going to work. He's meeting Rosie and getting to know her. He's going to his cafe where the barista is about to leave, and he's a bit worried about that. There's just a single sentence where he goes, "Oh my goodness, my equilibrium is being upset." And meanwhile, Icarus is falling from the sky. You know what you just said. Then the big things are happening. So what is this voice that you've developed here? How do you keep the equilibrium going within the story for a narrator whose equilibrium is constantly being threatened?
It's a bit tricky because ultimately we're talking about judgment in terms of what gets emphasized and what doesn't get emphasized. And that's the thing that I've been learning throughout my life as a writer, where when I first started writing, I would write stories where the thematic emotional elements are one-to-one, where this is directly oppositional to this other thing. And it took me a long time to realize that like good stories are never one-to-one like that. And with this story, it's really hard to find a way to bring the moments where the background of the story, the larger events that are happening in the society in which the characters live in, the moments where it intrudes into the story, those moments were quite tricky to get right because they have to be simultaneously, they have to do the work of dispensing meaning, but also with a really light touch and not overwhelm anything with it. And honestly, like the way it really happened towards the end is I just realized that the way I talk to my friends and the way I move through the world in my life, and which is quite similar to this narrator. This narrator and I have a lot in common, not least of which the fact that we're both bartenders. But one of the elements that was really it was hard to get right, but it worked as soon as the draft came together. It's sort of like when you see it sort of thing, where I know what a credible conversation looks like where I'm at a bar with my friends and we're talking about emojis, but we're also really talking about how much anxiety we have over the bushfires. Or in this case, if the story was set in today, during now, we'd probably be worried about COVID-19. And there's that element of like seriousness and unseriousness. And a lot of the time people don't want to think about bad things. And I'd rather have fun with my friends and talk about, have a conversation about which emoji we feel like we are deep down, as opposed to talking about how we're all heading towards catastrophe and disaster, and we don't really know how to handle that.
The bathos as well is charming in this, because the way you brought up the emojis, the way that the narrator, 1 minute he's contemplating a Japanese essay on the floor in porcelain, and the people he's talking to want to know what emoji he would be. Is that, it's not forced at all, because I'm thinking that this is probably very real for the way people your age and in your circumstances, living in a suburb in a big city, talk to each other. Do you talk normally with things like, you know, the philosophy of Japanese porcelain and a poet? Is this something that you'd take to work with you?
Well, a lot of my friends are quite bookish, so we do end up talking about that stuff a lot. But also, when I say that this narrator and I are similar, it's not through the way. We do move through the world in similar ways, but one of the ways in which I see this character as being closer to who I am than most other characters I've written is because he does have that tangential thinking. He does, he will be talking to a friend of his and then thinking about an essay that he read the other day. And I feel like I recognize that with me and my friends, in the sense that my best friend's a poet, and several of my closest friends are writers as well. And we do talk like that a bit, but it's also the fact that I really like this character's way of, I really like the fact that he's a deep, sensitive guy who's quite thoughtful, because I know that for me, the parts of him that expresses things that way is not how it is for me, in the sense that if I had a thought about a Japanese writer while talking to my friend about porcelain, I'd be like, what are you thinking about, dude? I'd be reminding myself to pay attention to my friend, as opposed to going off in my own little thought processes. I don't know. There's something, and the characters are a bit older, in the sense that they're in their late 20s as opposed to in their mid 20s. And there's a definite shift in terms of the way they move through the world. That is a specifically late 20s thing, because it's something that I only noticed in the past few years as I hurtled towards my 30s. It's the way they speak is something that I really wanted to emphasize as belong to a very specific late 20s. Most of them work in or around the arts or have precarious jobs or livings. Some of them might be studying, others might be, finding their feet in their careers for the first time. So it's this combination of, and obviously me and my friends are all overeducated and underemployed. So like, that's another thing. That's
you're not overeducated. I don't believe you.
Well, I am underemployed, so
I get it. But you're employed doing terrific stories like this, and I'm beginning to realise now why I enjoyed it so much and why I leant towards it so much, because of it does remind me of that joy in finding things that you're reading, and in finding thoughts that that you're thinking, and knowing that this is something that you just want to keep doing and sharing, and that comes through with the narrator. But there's moments in this where the narrator reveals himself as a worried soul. This word, this equilibrium, that he could tip towards somewhere else. I'm actually quite pleased to hear that he's not part of your novel, that he stands alone in this short story. But what were you saying there about, I think, what was the quote? A fragile, treacherous moment that leaves you in its wake. What were you suggesting there?
Well, a lot of, not to over intellectualize the story, but a lot of the story was written after I watched a few lectures on precarity by the American feminist academic and scholar Judith Butler, and she talks about this notion of the fact that precarity stop being a temporary state that we enter into our lives in certain moments of fraught, that are fraught for us. But precarity has become this, basically this new normal where work is no longer guaranteed. We no longer, we can't afford to buy houses. We can only ever rent houses now. And we all exist in some sort of, under the heel of some sort of structure that isn't kind to us. And the daily toll, these kinds of, what they really are our society being okay with a huge portion of the population living in indignity, and living in a life like that, which is something that I am concerned with because I live that life. I don't have regular stable jobs. I'm constantly staving off the fear of not being able to pay my bills or my rent. And I haven't really had a situation that I could be comfortable in my adult life. And people of my generation, our adult lives are bookended by two of the largest tragedies of the last 30 years. We've got the global financial crisis, which hit me just as I was 18, and a lot of my friends were just becoming adults for the first time around that time. And now, towards the end of our 20s, we have this pandemic situation. And what I'm interested in is examining the implications of an entire generation of people who don't have safety, security, and any notion of stability. And so for people who exist in that state, I'm interested in exploring the implications of that. What did their love lives look like? What did their work lives look like? What did their friendships look like? How did they move through the world? And this story is an exploration of that specific idea and notion. And the character is aware of it. And it bubbles to the surface every now and then. And things in his life are changing so much that the things that have been stable for him, such as his favorite barista at the cafe for the past 4 years, as soon as that thing is threatened, he starts to realize how much he was relying on any stability in his life and how much he was latching onto the one or two stable things in his life.
And his discussions are with so many different kinds of people. There's the fellow who makes the sandwiches. I think he's got, and again, you're very careful. I'm very conscious of the different kinds of people in the story. And I wanted to ask you, and it's a question that has been buzzing in my head since I looked at After Australia and then realised that I wanted to speak to somebody, and then enjoyed your story and wanted to speak to you. Is there a danger when you get invited to do these things, and it's terrific because I lots of people can read you, but is there a danger that you get typecast? You mentioned to the pin that, you know, every few years everybody says, oh, there's a problem with African young people, and everybody rushes to you to have a comment. Is there a danger for you as a writer that you'll get typecast?
Well, I thought about that for a while. I thought about the danger because I'm very aware of the fact that I'm very aware of the fact that anything I do write is singular, because I can only think of, actually in the literary space, I guess there's not that many at all African Australians who. And I know that the first book that I release is going to be the first literary novel by an African person who lives in Australia, who's not Maxine Beniba Clark. And I'm aware of that at the same time as I'm aware of my slight disinclination to be seen as an authority on anything. And a lot of my work, for better or worse, sits in an incredibly ambiguous space of, and part of me is interested in the idea of of my contribution to Australian literature for someone whose identity is marginal at best and invisible at every other time. But at the same time, I do sometimes wonder if I'm actually, I don't know. It's an interesting thing. I used to be worried about it a lot more, but these days I'm thinking that my job as a writer is to be read, and the way people read me is only partly in my control. So the best that I can do is write my little weird, restrained, quite placid stories and have other people make meaning of that in the ways that matter to them.